Thank you very much, Dr. Azhar Ibrahim, for, I would say, an inspiring talk as well, not just simply an academic talk. Most of us may have expected coming from a lecturer or an academic. Okay, before proceeding to our question and answer session with our other attendees, I would like to take this opportunity as a benefit for me to perhaps pose the first question. I would like to first ask Professor Ahmad Fauzi. As Dr. Ahmad Fauzi, you have presented quite a, as I mentioned earlier, a comprehensive overview about the problem of xenophobia, and also in some ways how does it relate to a pandemic, which covers various geographical, historical, and in some way discursive, philosophical, religious tradition as well. Or in other words, the problem of xenophobia, it's not just simply a small certain issues which is isolated in certain areas. We can see this quite apparently in quite a wide scale throughout, if I could just simply say, this human civilization. So it's not nothing new, as if we could perhaps see the problem of xenophobia as if in some way it is natural within a social, psychological problem to humanity, as if it's part of a disease to human beings itself. So based on such statement, if I'm putting, maybe in some ways sounds a bit extreme, but do you consider the problem of xenophobia, which perhaps is caused by the sense of hatred, which could happen to anyone, which could happen to any communities or any societies in a situation of fear, in a situation of threat, and usually it's being manifested towards other people, the people who we don't see as being part of us, or who we don't have some sense of belong. Or in a more straightforward way to put, anyone, including we ourselves, we could either be a victim, a vulnerable victim to xenophobia, or at the same time, we could in any ways could be a person who are guilty in conducting or in the actions or whatever things which relates to xenophobia. How would you respond to that, Dr. Mafauzi? Or maybe say, do you think that among humans, it is some way quite natural that xenophobia could actually happen?
Thank you, Brother Ihsan, okay, for your question just now. No, it's true. Okay, you were saying that unfortunately, okay, for some communities, once they become the victim, and later they can become the victimizer. Okay, in fact, as I've mentioned, okay, in my presentation just now, okay, the people of Chinese stock, for instance, okay, we all over the world empathize with them, okay, because they are being treated very rudely, okay, in Western countries, okay, even in Middle Eastern countries, okay, as a result, okay, of the pandemic. They are being accused, okay, of spreading the pandemic. They've been refused service in restaurants, okay, and so on. They've been refused entry to tourist sites, okay, for instance. Okay, and yet, why is it that when a particular society is not on the receiving end, but on having the upper hand, then it can get transformed into being a victimizer, and we have problems of blacks, okay, being discriminated, being victimized by the Chinese, okay, and there's widespread, okay, widespread reports about this, okay, in Guangzhou, okay, for instance, okay, blacks being thrown into the streets, okay, being denied places to stay, despite them, okay, being, okay, in the country as guest workers. And remember the cartoon I showed just now, okay, for those of you who understand Chinese, when we were invited here, the black, okay, the black figure in the garbage bin was saying, so, and what is this? Okay, suddenly you throw me out. Okay, so there is this selfishness in human beings. If I relate it to Sufi doctrine, as I was saying just now, okay, it's, selfishness, it's nafs. Okay, we are looking, okay, at ourselves, at our own community, at our own family, merely through selfish ends, and without wanting to empathize, okay, with the other, okay, as if we don't belong to a global okay, a family of human beings. Okay, despite this pandemic, okay, not differentiating between class, between religion, between race. Okay, although at the beginning of the pandemic in February, March, there was speculation, okay, whether it won't affect blacks that much, whether it won't affect Indians that much. Okay, but now all the myth, I think, has evaporated. Okay, with the death toll, okay, in India surging. Okay, for instance, so I think there is this widespread human weakness of failing to see, okay, ourselves as part of the human family, but we see ourselves as part of a compartmentalized community, and this leads to communalism. Okay, that is some problem that we have had, okay, since the beginning of mankind, and the spread of mankind into different nations, tribes, communities. Okay, and this is something which is ordained by God. Okay, for those of us who are familiar with the Quran, okay, look at Al-Hujurat, I think it's 113. Okay, we created you nations and tribes so that you know each other, and look at God's beauty and grace. Okay, in terms of creating people of different colors, okay, different nations, different languages. Okay, it's a sign of God's creation, which I think in the large history of humankind, most people have not, okay, been able to grasp that. Okay, and in the history of the prophets, this is, okay, one of the main reasons. Okay, in fact, it's the main reason why God, from time to time, has sent messengers of God. Okay, to bring back humanity to their senses, bringing people back to religion, and not merely institutional religion, but back to their fitrah. Fitrah, the state of nature. Okay, state of nature, the state of loving one another. Of course, if you go to Western philosophy, you have a different state of nature in Locke and a different state of nature in Hobbes, where according to Hobbes, it's state of war. The state of war according to nafs. But then the state of nature according to the fitra is okay, it's one which accords with human beings, okay, being in admiration and in love of one another. And I would say that this question, or this curriculum of love, is very much lacking, okay, in the educational system, even the Islamic educational, okay, system that we find in schools, in madrasas, and so on, okay, which have focused mostly, okay, on questions of legalistic, okay, of legalistic things, or issues, okay, of praying, of paying zakat, merely as a physical submission to God, okay, without the spiritual connection. And in terms of the spiritual connection, okay, the main organ, okay, here, okay, for human beings is the heart, not merely the mind. And if you read how in the West, for instance, people have found solace, okay, in the poems of Rumi. In fact, Jalaluddin Rumi, the 13th century, Turkish poet, okay, is a best-selling poet actually in the West, at least one of the most best-selling poets in the West, in the West, because okay, his poems are, his poems put forward the doctrine of love. Okay, and I feel human beings, deeply in their heart, they realize that this is a shortcoming. But who among the politicians who control power in this world are willing and able to admit this and to include, okay, such lessons of love, okay, in in their curriculum? Okay, see, for instance, coming to the situation in Malaysia. Now, each community seem to have a problem with another community, and we always think in terms of merely our own community. Okay, not to mention in the human community, but not even the national community. And what is a problem for one community may not be a problem for the other. Okay, we have problems of uh, deaths of certain people, which has been unsolved by the state. Okay, say for instance the disappearance, okay, of Pastor Koh and Amri Chekman. I think as far as the Malay community is concerned, most of them think, he's a non-issue. He's just a pastor. Okay, he's just a Christian. Amri is allegedly a Shia. So what? So there is no empathy on a person lost in the human being. Okay, most of the Malays don't think that there's a problem. But for the Malays, the death of Adib, the fireman, is a problem, which I don't think, even among my Indian friends, they don't think that that's a community. That's a big issue for them. And perhaps for the Indian community, the death of Kugan, okay, under police detention, that's a bigger issue. Which for the Malay community, then it's a non-issue, because for the Malay community, for them, Kugan is just a criminal. Okay, in contrast with Adib, who was a fireman, okay, who was working on behalf of the nation. So we are not trained to emphasize with the problem of any other community, okay, and we look merely to other people in terms of self-interest. And from my own, experience, okay, with some in the Chinese community, okay, who feel grief of worried, okay, if some of their children embrace Islam, because they think that their children will become Malays. So what is the problem here is that we have an irreconcilable, incorrigible linkage, okay, between being Malay and being Muslim, as if being Muslim in this country, you need to be Malay. Why not becoming a good Muslim and remain Chinese culturally? Does it, is that not a problem? But in this country, it seems to be a problem, okay, such that the question of conversion to Islam, I think, has been, it creates, okay, problems of, it can be a really big communal issue. And then, of course, there are other, okay, worldly attachments to the question of religion. Okay, being a Muslim means that you gain, some worldly advantages in terms of affirmative action and so on. So these things are tied. Okay, these worldly interests are tied to one another, are tied to the religion, such that the beauty of faith and love, okay, are not emphasized when we talk about religion, unfortunately. And I think this is a problem all the world over, as I was saying. And as a political scientist, okay, my work, one of them is to study politicians. Okay, and politicians don't like us, political scientists, because we write bad things about them. So if I were to go on speaking, I would go and criticize many politicians, and many politicians, okay, will be complaining about political scientists and so on. That's one of the reasons I think why political science is not a very interesting subject to study among Malaysians here. Okay.
Right, Dr. Fauzi, as you mentioned, your last point in some ways, some critical perspectives towards politicians. I think it's quite an important arguable point that some criticism or perhaps some sense of hatred towards politicians that should not be considered as xenophobic, I would say. Yeah, it's quite common as well. Okay, but that's definitely a different topic of discussion. I personally, I also have one specific question to Dr. Azhar, perhaps on a solution more at the policy level, as Dr. Azhar was talking more about that. But I think it's better for me to look into some questions being posed by others, and maybe I will revisit back my questions in the later part. I will just start with a question which is still, this question comes from Facebook, so I'm not aware of who's the actual person who's asking the question, but I just read through the question first. Yeah, xenophobia is an outcome of the failure of racial and cultural integration, although some countries claim that there can always be unity in diversity. So the question also continues that, is it discrimination or is it a manifestation of racial cultural preferences? So I think this question relates to xenophobia could also be a product of the failure of unity in diversity, which is one important value in a lot of countries, especially and including in Malaysia. But while at the same time, in such plural society, the elements of cultural preferences and to retain racial and cultural identity is still very much significant. Perhaps Dr. Azhar can provide some comments or feedbacks on the question, and maybe later Dr. Fauzi can add as well.
Basically, if you look around the literature, the terminology is conflated on racism, stigma, prejudice, racism, xenophobia, right? There are specific terms, right? And there are, of course, there is a generic term too, in the sense that, there's a conflation and there is a kind of like double usage, right? Technical things, I think it can be settled, but what is actually the problem here? The problem is basically where you do unjust to another group, right? And that could be in a manifestation of whether it's a conscious policy from the authorities, it could be built up in the institution, right? It could be something in the cultural ethos that have been accepted, right? Or it could be something in the sentiments, or worse, it's a religious attitude, right? I mean, the study by Gordon Alport on the nature of prejudice, right? One of the proposition is that the propensity of churchgoers are actually higher, right, to engage in things on racism as compared to non-churchgoer. But the question here is also, according to Alport, we can prove that there are people who are very religious are the very people who also oppose racism, right? So in the end, he made it more refined studies, and he concluded that it's actually the type of religious orientation, right? The extrinsic type versus the intrinsic type. The extrinsic type is the one that, attached to what they call social security, to vested interests, right? This extrinsic type is the one that prone to committing racism, xenophobia, or stigma. Whereas the intrinsic type, right, which see human, in a more universal brotherhood, right, that see everyone in equal terms, right? Just like what Professor Ahmad Fauzi mentioned about the Sufistic tradition, right? That part of the tradition can be considered as, of course, Sufi is not the only one. There are many other religious expressions too that belongs to this intrinsic type, right? But along the way in our social experiment and our social exposure, the extrinsic part becomes actually more prominent than the intrinsic part, right? And worse also, when COVID-19 came, right, erupted, it coincided very well with the rise of the ultra-right. The ultra-right is all over the map in this world. In Europe, in America, right, in subcontinent India, in Southeast Asia, right, we can see, right, this ultra-right coming. So it aggravates because all along, we know that there's always a problem of racism, xenophobia, and all those things, right? But we think that this is just, well, a problem that might go away, with the idea that, well, if you increase the economic pie where everybody shared, things will settle. No, it's not as simple as that, right? We often also tends to take up, let's say, we enunciate, means we tell what is actually good. Peace, discourse, harmony, solidarity. We enunciate. The enunciating discourse is actually more prominent, which is good. I'm not saying it's not good, it's good. But our denunciating discourse, we denunciate. For example, we take up against racism, stigma, xenophobia. That is actually not part and parcel. I mean, let's look around. Let's go to a bookstore. Where can you find a work, right? A decent work where young boys and girls at age of 18 and above able to read all these kind of things. Instead, they are bombarded every day with all this kind of ultra-right sentiment, right? That my group are more superior. My group have more rights over the rest. The rest are all not good. They're threatening us, blah, 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 right? So, you see, when this problem cropped up, all right, we need to tell ourselves there's a lot of homework to be done. And the best part, there are many things that we have neglected. I think, Professor Ahmad Fauzi, myself working in campus, let's ask ourselves, right? I mean, how many people work on the nature of prejudice, like what Alport Gordon did in the 1960s in Harvard, right? I mean, it was just silence, right? How many people now working on, let's say, on the moral exclusion, right? Not many, right? We have people who talk about, the politics of ultra-right, but to move deeper into its sociological dimension, into its social history and its social psychology, that requires a lot of effort, right? And most importantly too, upon completing in this kind of discourse, what we need is also social pedagogy, right? Social discoursing, right? I mean, good to have social inquiry, but if you don't have social discoursing, it will go nowhere. And every day, the media, the mass media, the popular media, won the day every second. As compared, here we are, teachers, researchers trying to tell students our catchment area is very low, right? And discourse like this, look, how many people attended? 16 plus panelists 8. I mean, this is, you can tell yourself. I mean, of course, we know we have Facebook transmission and so on, but at the end of the day, more and more work to be done. I hope that this concern of us is not just thematics, right? This is part and parcel. It must be a continuous, right? When we oppose racism, when we oppose xenophobia, that must be part of our utterance every day.
Thank you, Dr. Azhar, for emphasizing the important point again. Okay, I'm going to proceed with another question, this time by Nur Hikmah binti Mat Ali on Zoom. Okay, so the question relates to capitalism. How has capitalism exacerbated the impact of COVID-19 on communities, particularly on the discourse on the coronavirus? What's missing from the discourse on the coronavirus and its impact on particularly the marginalized communities? So I didn't look into this picture. In fact, the perspective on capitalism and the situation of the economy, we haven't discussed too much on that part. Perhaps there are some comments or feedback from Dr. Azhar and Dr. Ahmad Fauzi. Maybe Dr. Ahmad Fauzi can go first.
Ihsan, and also to no, Hikmah, I think, who came up with the question. I think the one of the main planks, okay, of capitalism is a maximization of profit. Okay, if for those who are familiar with I mean, the study of economics in a capitalistic sense, and this is one of the assumptions, okay, main assumptions, okay, that I mean we have, okay, when we construct economic models and so on. And what actually prompts maximization of profit is that it's self-interest. Okay, it's self-interest, and I was saying just now, it is self-interest, okay, which drives, okay, human greed. Okay, in fact, not just human greed, okay, but the vices, okay, or the bad habits, okay, or in sophisticated terminology, mazmuma. Okay, these are evil things which we see it jives, okay, with I mean capitalism, and it's a problem, okay, for us students, okay, when we study economics without a particular critical attitude, and we imbibe, okay, doctrines of economics, whether it's capitalistic or whether it's communistic, as if, okay, that is a truth, okay, which must be accepted. Okay, and that is why, for instance, I mean, people cannot imagine those who are in the banking industry of banks waiving, I mean, interest payments. Okay, for instance, they can defer, but they don't want to waive. Okay, even in times of I mean great difficulty, okay, such as during this I mean pandemic, for instance, just because the economic theories, okay, are so fixed, okay, are so fixed that I mean banks should maximize, okay, their profits when they indulge, okay, in money lending, okay, which is also tantamount to money creation. Okay, in the literature on riba, okay, for those Muslims who are interested in Islamic economics, okay, this is one of the strengths. Okay, and I think Muslim economists especially, okay, should not be trapped, okay, in a particular mindset that there are things, okay, which we study at university, okay, in through textbooks and so on, that are fixed. But who among us, okay, will be innovative, okay, will be courageous or brave enough to be going against, okay, this conventional wisdom in a particular discipline? Not many are. Okay, not many are. And there was one article which I referenced, okay, in my presentation. Western philosophy is racist. Okay, if you look into that article, okay, there are a few stories of how people from the East, okay, go to Western universities to study and encounters scholarly prejudice because they wanted to propose or to study philosophies that are alien to the dominant Western schools of thought. Okay, and one of them even became a well-known filmmaker. Now look at that. Okay, I mean, look at that article. Okay, he became a filmmaker because he was frustrated while doing his graduate study. Okay, that he wanted to oppose the dominant trend. Okay, and the dominant trend in Western philosophy. Okay, but his supervisors and his teachers at the department were not open to the idea and to the idea that there are other philosophies, okay, which are very well established and more humanitarian centered than Western philosophy. So I think this is the Same with the case in economics. And if we look at some of the criticisms of Islamic economics, even the criticisms of Islamic banking, okay, that is because these Islamic, so-called Islamic creations, okay, merely imitate, okay, their Western prototypes, okay, with a bit of nudging, so that the practices become Sharia compliant, but without changing the overall capitalistic structure. Okay, and you can look into this in the criticisms of the so-called discipline of Islamic economics. Go to the writings of Timur Quran. Okay, for instance, Said Farid Aratas, okay, at the NUS also has criticized Islamic economics on these terms. So when a pandemic happens, it jives with human greed. Okay, it jives, okay, with the failure of human civilization, okay, to improve humanity through building love, okay, and mutual affection, okay, with one another. And then politicians come in, politicians bank in, okay, on human evil, on human evilness, on human evil attitudes, okay, so that they gain a political advantage, okay, in terms of being re-elected, okay, in terms of gaining support from the people and so on. So evil builds upon evil, builds upon evil, and this is, this is how, okay, we see, okay, the downward trend, okay, in human civilization happening. And one of the main reasons is also the the decline, okay, this decline of humanity in educational trends. Even in education, okay, where education in the higher education institutions, okay, are supposed to build mutual affection between one another. What we see, okay, is human greed, and then the craze to outdo one another, in terms of publications, okay, to defeat the other university in terms of ranking. Now, what is this? Okay, there is just greed and self-centeredness, and if politicians keep on doing the same thing, whereas they are the ones who are supposed to lead communities and lead societies, I don't know. It's left to some stubborn academics like me or like Dr. Azhar, who can only voice out what we think over, okay, over forums like this, which only 50 or 100 people will listen, and that's all. Everything else goes into the air. And especially in these times where social media, okay, grabs the headlines. This is an age of misinformation and disinformation. It's not information age. Okay, you can look into, okay, a lot of things written, okay, about this so-called information age, okay, of ICT revolution. It has actually led to a lot of misinformation, disinformation, okay, and wrong things being accepted as truth. We are now in the age of post-truth, okay, not truth. Okay, if you look at reports that some 5G installations, okay, were there have been attacks in the West against 5G installations, okay, because China is accused of deliberately installing these 5G antennas to weaken the immune system of the Westerners. Okay, so what sort of propaganda it is? And yet many people do believe them. Many people do actually believe them. Okay, and there are some good articles reporting on the frustrations of frontliners, of doctors, of nurses. Okay, because most of the news going on, okay, about this pandemic, this is so far from reality, and yet this is what the average, okay, the average person believes in, unfortunately.
Okay. Thank you, Hikmah, for that question. I think I will zoom in. The present manifestation of capitalism today, for one type, is actually the neoliberal capitalism, right? And we know the mantra of neoliberal capitalism is always efficiency, productivity, profit. You heard about it, right? And of course, to be in that the schema of ranking and so on, right? Of course, we can see the effects in two fronts. One, direct effects, and one, of course, indirect effects. Right? Let's look at, for example, it affect how neoliberal capitalism affect, for example, the healthcare, the healthcare system. Right? In some countries, right, where the healthcare system, and if you know that neoliberal capitalism calls for the dominancy of the private sector over the public sector, right? To a point that they clamor and they lobby for privatization of social public amenities, right? Water, hospitals, even university, right? They wanted university to be all privatized, right? So in some countries, those that succumb to this demand of privatization, especially the healthcare, is the one that actually are not able to manage well with this crisis, right? One good example between Chinese health system as compared to European health system. European health system, yeah, especially those that embrace this thorough neoliberal schema, collapse as compared to China. Yeah, luckily we in Singapore and Malaysia, right? Our hospitals are generally state system, state resources managing health system. Imagine in a situation where our health system is still held, yeah, by the private sector 70% and state sector only 30%. You can expect, right? The health system cannot withstand the pressure and the demand, right? So this is one, right? It shows in many countries. Two, the what we call the workers' welfare, right? What you see today, migrant workers, whether documented or documented, are actually the victims of that very process of what we call this global demand for cheap workers, basically, right? You import them, all right? You make them into cheap labor, all right, with no social security, all right? And then, when things like this happen, all right, where are the insurance to cover them, right? Where are which hospitals to cover them? In the past, one or two accident, it's okay, company can cover. But when it comes to big problem like this, who's going to cover? So it seems now that the neoliberal project of bringing in this cheap labor is much to be questioned and to be desired. And now I think many governments are thinking that this is not the way to go. Yeah, and then of course we keep on asking the kind of globalization, right? We talked before this COVID-19, everyone celebrated globalization, right? But the kind of globalization that actually in operation is actually the globalization of the MNCs, right? Those who have capital move around their capital to the best area that can maximize their profit, right? And when once they rip it off, they will leave, right? So that kind of globalization that's actually happening, but not the kind of globalization in terms of our human endeavor of universal solidarity. We don't have that kind of solidarity, right? So you see, the discourse on globalization actually is very much if you go through the readings of Henry Giro and Paulo Freire and Peter McLaren, you can see how much neoliberal capitalism, right, injected very much influence into this kind of discourse of globalization, right? And they denounce it. That globalization that meant for, let's say, global solidarity, non-existent anymore, right? People say, it's archaic, the idea of, cooperation between the poor or the third world. People don't want to talk. But instead, everybody embracing, not knowing that actually that is part and parcel of the agenda. And if you look at how neoliberal increase, let's say, property, right? Property in many urban areas, yeah, in center of the town, also in the periphery of the cities, the increasing property value, right, means also the residents or the population in that area needs to be expelled in the name of what you want to call development. You know what being built? Condominiums. What these condominiums for? Not just the super rich, but also those expatriates coming in. So this big project where what they call it development also meant homeless for many urban poor population. Right? This is what Saskia Sassen mentioned about the book called Expulsion. This is actually part and parcel of the neoliberal effect to the economy, right? And then lastly, even in terms of ideational, right? This, we don't know that neoliberalism also penetrate into the kind of thinking, even in discussing, right? And I would say, and many books have mentioned also, the very idea of a discourse, of identity discourse, right? The euphoria to see everything in a smaller unit, right? Gender, right? Ethnicity, consumption, all these small little things, is actually part and parcel that serve the very ideology, right? I mean, it's very hard. This is where I would say the indirect link, right? And this discourse, all right, actually serve the power that be, because everyone is fragmented. The moment you're fragmented, the moment you don't see bigger picture, the better it is, because it meant that you just need to consume more and more. All right. So this is a process that I mean, people in academia and in teaching, we sometimes we are not conscious of it, right? In fact, we are part of it actually, right? But the insidious element penetrating into our mind, not just in policies, even in our mind, is some things that we need to deliberate. In fact, very unlikely, right, that the discourse on neoliberalism, all right, can be a popular one, because I think it will be much resistant, right? Because the moment you say about neoliberal capitalism, people say, oh, this is socialist lah, all right, this is Marxist lah, and then with that, all right, everybody don't want to say, unless they think that you belong to some naughty group. Yeah, that's my take.
Thank you very much, Dr. Azhar, on your feedback and comment. Thank you very much, Dr. Fauzi, as well, on your previous and earlier inputs. Definitely, there are also, in fact, some questions that also relates to discussion topics about misinformation related to the problem. And there's also a question which also would like to get some further elaboration about Sufism and how does it relate to xenophobia. But unfortunately, due to the limitation of time that we are having, we will not be able to address such questions. But I think generally, most the important key points from the remaining questions are mostly already addressed during the earlier sessions by the speakers. So just to wrap up, I would like to thank Dr. Azhar Ibrahim and Dr. Ahmad Fauzi for speaking in our webinar session this time. I would like to thank all our attendees and participants for taking part and posing questions, and of course apologies for those questions which I wasn't able to address. In fact, I've also got some questions which I could not address as well, but I'm sure I take that in a positive and a hopeful note that hopefully we can continue our engagement with our invited guests, Dr. Ahmad Fauzi and Dr. Azhar Ibrahim, again in the near future, especially perhaps in one of the coming weeks, if we can have Dr. Ahmad Fauzi to comment maybe some of important topics related to politics now, as we've been covered more of the topic of COVID-19. Our politics in Malaysia is also getting a lot more complex, yeah. But hopefully this we can leave it for other weeks. So I would like to end again by saying thank you. And before I end up, I just want to also inform all our attendees and participants that in 2 weeks from now, we are going to have another webinar sessions, which is going to be with one second. Dr. Heba Rauf on the 4th of July, 3 p.m. So the topic that Dr. Heba Rauf will be talking about is COVID-19 pandemic strengthening authoritarianism in the Arab states. So lastly, before ending up, thank you everyone. Thank you Dr. Azhar again. Thank you Dr. Mat Fauzi, and hope to see you all in the coming weeks. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.